Welcome to another episode of GovChats. It's hosted by the Georgia Technology Authority's Office of Digital Services and Solutions. GovChats is a non-sponsored space for government and public sector leaders to share their thoughts, plans, and ideas. In today's episode, we will dive into the topic of artificial intelligence, specifically how AI is being harnessed to drive innovation, improve public services, and foster a tech-savvy government through AI programs and initiatives across the states of Georgia, Maryland, and Vermont. So let's unpack. My name is Nikhil Deshpande. I'm the Chief Digital and AI Officer with the state of Georgia. And joining me are Nishant Shah, Senior Advisor for Responsible AI for the state of Maryland, Josiah Resch, Chief AI and Data Officer for the state of Vermont. Gentlemen, welcome to GovChats.
Thanks, Nico. I love your podcast voice, by the way. It's like very soothing.
This is very unlikely for me because I'm always, at the speaking end of the podcast, so very rarely moderating. So thank you for the confidence. So AI really doesn't need much introduction lately. I mean, I don't think any of us would have spent a day without knowing something or reading something about AI or some of the things that are happening around us. So, I feel like the entire year of 2023, I always call it the year of AI overview. Most of the conversations across any of the vendor partners, other states, everyone was just kind of like trying to understand the distinctions. But what I saw was that that year ended really interesting because at the end of every year, the National Association for State CIOs, NASCIO, publishes their CIO top 10 priorities. And for 2024, artificial intelligence took the third spot on the list. Now, technically, I would say that would be a second spot, but this was like the first time, or maybe after a long time, the first spot was tied between security and digital government or digital services. So that's why I guess AI was on the second spot or the third spot as per the listing. But what interesting was that like AI was nowhere in the ranking in the previous year's priority lineup, right? So I would say it's interesting, but it's not surprising. Obviously, we all know that state government IT shops are working to expand their, AI understanding in how AI can be integrated into service delivery, citizen experience, workforce upskilling. So I wanted to, kind of start out from that perspective of AI is here to stay. And your two states, like, Vermont and Maryland, are one of the few states who actually appointed somebody in response to handling AI. So I guess, what I would start this conversation with is looking at Josiah from Vermont, because in 2022, I believe, and this is based on our previous conversations and something I quickly looked up, that in early 2022, Vermont passed an act relating to the use and oversight of AI in state government, right? So this was probably somewhere in the early calendar year of 2022, and nobody knew that year in November when ChatGPT was launched. And that's really where, again, AI was reintroduced and put on everyone's radar, and everyone started talking about AI. So having said that, I just wanted to ask Josiah, Josiah, can you share with us your journey and how this all came about in Vermont?
So yeah, it's was kind of a crazy time. Middle of 2022 when I took the role, our legislature had just released or just put together the law that created a division of artificial intelligence with no positions and a director, and stood up an AI council to be a long-term body focused on how AI was going to be used within state government. And so I had been with the state for about 5, 6 years before that as a developer. I had helped the Agency of Transportation build some of their first in-house AI projects, kind of taught myself how to do neural networks in the browser, which is not an ideal way to do neural networks, but it worked. We built some stuff, got some experience, and then when the AI director position came along, I was like, yeah, that'd be a cool thing to do. So so we worked on with the AI Council a code of ethics. We started getting some experience with AI tools that were out there and documenting what we had that was AI already. And then we finished our, I think, second draft of the code of ethics, and ChatGPT landed. And we we're like, well, now all of a sudden people mean something different when they're talking about AI from what they meant, 3, 4 weeks ago. The shift from machine learning AI to generative AI and large language models was pretty dramatic. So with that, we were able to kind of roll with that pivot. And what we were very pleased about was the code of ethics we had put together, the guiding principles, all kind of survived that transition. We didn't have to do a major rewrite of the code of ethics. The principles about transparency and explainability and bias and things like that, like all of those pieces were still really relevant in this new era. And we were positioned really well to kind of quickly pivot to governing generative AI. I think we had our first draft of our generative AI guidance for state employees out by February. So we were able to build pretty quickly on it and move.
February 23.
Yeah, February 23.
Yeah. So that was really early. That's really kind of like where most other states, I should say, were trying to understand the larger AI tent and all the ML and the deep learning piece. And it's interesting where like generative AI being a subset of AI, certainly that's the one that pulled everyone to pay attention to everything that came with AI. So I'm definitely going to come back to you a little more about understanding your job and how you are putting an AI program together for the state. But I want to also hear from Nishan as far as Maryland's start of journey into AI. Now, all of us were watching what the other states were doing, and somewhere in early this year, Maryland Governor Moore, I believe, unveiled kind of like 4 major IT projects as they claimed, and one of them was an executive order on AI, right? Like that's kind of like where they decided we want to move on this AI. And the other ones that I really kind of also cheered, other than obviously, the cyber partnership, but digital services and digital accessibility policy. So, something that has been very near and dear to what we have been doing, in Georgia as well. So can you walk us into like how all of that came together and really where you came into that mix and how things are going now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so my role, it's a new one sort of as of last September, and the whole concept there was sort of meant to cohere an AI strategy for the state that's responsible, ethical, productive, work in deep collaboration with legislators, with agency leaders, with the business community, with the academia, with other folks that are sort of key stakeholders here, and sort of put all that together as a set of sort of strategies and approaches, which then sort of got packaged as an executive order. And at the same time, there was an entirely sort of new leadership team joining the Department of Information Technology, a new head of digital experience, a new CISO, a new CTO. And so, it was sort of that time where it was like a time for introspection, where you could sort of look back and say, what were sort of the things missing from the last bunch of years, which would sort of push us now more towards a product focus in how we deliver services versus sort of, a much more sort of waterfall sort of, we all sort of know the sort of older school landscape there. And so, on the AI executive order side, you're right, Governor Moore signed this in sort of mid-January, and it mandates like a number of different things, adopting a set of principles, that all use of AI in the state should abide by, standing up an internal sort of governing body that we call the AI subcabinet. And we're in the midst of sort of cohering and norming and storming of exactly how it makes decisions and what should go up to it. And there's a whole bunch of sort of organizational work to do there to ensure that it's set up for success. It asks us to kick off a number of pilots and work on sort of governance to operationalize that set of principles. And then really get education and training in place for state employees. And sort of the last thing that it asked for really, and this one is maybe a little bit different from other states, is that it asked for a set of essentially we're calling horizon scanning exercises in workforce, in economic development and security, that's supposed to be highly specific to Maryland. So given our industrial base, given the port infrastructure, given sort of where jobs are today, do some set of sort of understand the velocity of these things and how AI is likely to impact those, and then package those as a set of recommendations for the governor and the legislature later this year, early next year. The one other thing I'll sort of add to that is that, building on that executive order, just as of really 2 weeks ago or so now, the state legislature passed an AI governance bill that ends up codifying a lot of this into law. It adds a definition of AI in statute. It requires AI inventories and impact assessments for higher risk systems and introduces this concept of a higher risk system in general. And I think personally, most excitingly, like it gives us a new procurement pathway to run proofs of concept more easily. And procurement being one of those tough things in this space, which, can take a long time. And with an emerging technology, it's not always, fit for purpose. So this sort of helps on that space. And maybe the last thing I'll add there is like, as an aside to all of that, I think getting to that bill was really a good collaboration between legislators and the executive branch. It was a complicated time because all this stuff is pretty new. We don't know what we don't know. We're trying to put things in place that ensure responsibility, but at the same time, it's moving so quickly. So you don't want to sort of overcorrect there. I think it was a good collaboration in that it sort of really centered operational considerations in the bill itself while it was being written, so that some of the complexities and nuances of language that are included in that bill writing process, are at least more likely to, I think, withstand the test of time. But TBD.
That's really interesting because everything that you were describing as part of the bill is very similar to something we are doing in Georgia. I mean, obviously, we still have not had an executive order. I believe in the sense of our overall dynamic as a state in how the executive branch operates, Vermont is a very heavily centralized IT setup versus I believe I guess Maryland and Georgia are kind of similar in that makeup. We are driving a lot of these things parallelly in partnership with state agencies as a central IT maybe organization. Something our organization GTA is doing is we have that governance framework that you both mentioned as part of your initial IT approach towards an IT program. We are putting together a lab, what we call as an innovation lab for exactly the same pilot and proof of concepts. GTA also makes IT contracting available for state agencies through our contracting team, our procurement team. So yeah, absolutely. That was one of the things we wanted to make sure was to just make this as seamless and as fast as possible as well. And I am actually very keen to actually read the bill now because it does seem like something that is very much happening parallelly between both the states. And third, you're right, last but not the least, the overall AI literacy, the drive towards that. So maybe just if we just kind of go back to the legislation piece, maybe we can dig a little further in that, because I was looking up the National Conference of State Legislators, and in 2024 legislation sessions, it looks like more than 40 states have introduced AI bills, and 6 states are actually successful in adopting some level of resolutions or enacting some sort of like legislation. Nishan, you mentioned the AI bill here right now, but Josiah, how about any activity this year within Vermont that has really just propelled what you all have already started 2 years ago?
Yeah, so we have a couple of bills introduced on AI. I think neither of the AI specific bills made crossover, but that was because we all kind of decided to invest our time in a data privacy law. So we've been working very closely with our legislature on that, and it looks like our legislature is actually going to be working really closely with the executive branch on data privacy for the long haul. They're putting some structures in place to do that. So that's really exciting. And we really see that data privacy piece as foundational to AI regulation. Kind of what you can and can't do with Vermonter data is about the only hook we have into what you can and can't do with AI in a lot of ways. So we see that as foundational there, but then also it also makes more explicit what is okay. And how consent needs to work and what transparency looks like. So more to come in that space. They're still kind of working on the final draft in the Senate, and then I expect there will be a conference committee. So we'll see what the final version of it looks like, but it's exciting times.
Yeah, that does sound exciting.
Maryland actually just passed a data privacy bill as well, at the same time as the governance bill, which is fantastic. To Josiah's point, really sort of a key condition for society's use of AI over time and in a trusted manner. I think it gives confidence that like resident and consumer data is treated really in a more thoughtful way than it has been otherwise, as a foundation for training data and AI models. I think it also gives a state like a common vocabulary here, which it's sometimes tough to get to that one place unless there's one cohering factor that everyone is forced to adopt. And so legislation is fantastic for that. I do worry sometimes about the longer term implications of like a patchwork of state, requirements versus a more comprehensive national legislation. And I think that's true with a lot of things in AI, like, are we all moving towards like a local optimum, or is there like a mountain beyond a mountain there that we should really be shooting for? And what are the implications there over the 10-year period rather than a shorter term? But much better to have it than not. And so hopefully something comes at the national level as well.
Yeah.
Nishan, what model did Maryland end up using for the data privacy bill? Was it a new invention, or based on Connecticut or Virginia or somebody else?
I think it was an amalgamation of those. Like, I think there's like, how many states have data privacy laws? Like quite a number, maybe like 7 or 8 or something like that. I forget exactly. But like this was based on a review of all those, and it was like taking a bunch from there, and it was really driven by by the legislators, the governor's office, and the chief privacy officer in Maryland, who did a great job there.
So as I guess some of these legislations are passed and getting implemented, I can hear some of these roles that seem like have existed or are newly created. Like Josiah, you recently got a new title as the chief data and AI officer. Before that, you pretty much had the AI function of it. And I remember having conversations with you about how closely it should be working with a data person or a data officer, and you were it. Yes. Nishan, I'm also guessing that you all have a chief data officer within your state. I'm just trying to kind of maybe paint a picture of like the dynamic between these roles. Of obviously, we all know at this point that like AI is going to be only as effective as good data. So within your setups, how do you see that function flowing as far as, say, Josiah, you putting your data hat on and then putting the AI hat on?
Yeah, so we started with a director of artificial intelligence as a separate group that was parallel, kind of a peer to the chief data officer. And that worked pretty well for establishing the practice, because it really helped to have kind of that direct access to CIO and to other executives throughout the state as we were getting that practice stood up. now that we've attained some level of maturity there, we were really finding that the thing that was getting in the way of scaling our AI products or AI prototypes and like turning them into prod was like data readiness. And so, everyone's talked about the importance of doing data governance and stewardship and cataloging for forever. And now it's like, well, actually, this is going to be a blocker if you don't have it done.
Yes.
And so we, kind of looked out across the landscape and decided it made sense to combine the offices and really focus what had historically, for Vermont anyway, been kind of an academic role around data to something that was a bit more practical, driving data insights and analytics on one side and then AI on the other. So that was kind of why we combined them. I'm actually, if any other states are looking for a director of AI, I currently have a job posting up for my old role, which will kind of serve as my deputy, and focus on AI operationalization, because we think we've gotten a long way on the policy front. It's not done, but we kind of, the focus can now shift to actually doing implementations.
Yeah. I read somewhere about the rise of Gen AI being a stress test for data governance and management, right? And it's while it's an opportunity for data stewards to shine. How about in Maryland, Nishant? How is that?
Yeah. And it's a stress test on data governance, but also for just all sorts of institutional processes. I think it makes like the fault lines in sort of a traditional IT organization much more clear, or much more sort of obvious. So, Nikhil, you mentioned sort of this like dichotomy between a centralized approach and a more federated model. As a little bit of context, like Maryland is highly federated. We have a pretty new leadership team. We have an entirely like newly stood up governance, risk, and compliance team. Maryland Digital Service that's just in the midst of being stood up as well. So there's lots of sort of like norming and storming that's happening with critical teams. And that sort of creates like, at least in Maryland, a building the plane while flying it sort of dynamic. And I know a lot of states are sort of going through the same thing. So, an example is like our GRC team is rethinking its approval risk list processes for software, and software leveraging AI should obviously be a part of that rather than some distinct set of things. So we need both sort of like short-term approaches to make progress now in unblocking exploitation, and then longer-term approaches, which are like, as these institutional artifacts get built out and sort of the AI work can start leveraging those more. So that's sort of like, with that background, is sort of where this senior advisor role began to slot in. So the way we had conceptualized it was, we're at the very foundational stage. We're at a sort of earlier, in terms of like a maturity framework, we're significantly like earlier than Vermont is, of course, right now. And so, we're at the stage where like in that foundational approach, it makes sense to have like sort of one person who's cohering approaches and sort of focusing on everything from policy to strategy to product to et cetera. Then it's from those learnings where you start seeing like, okay, what roles are necessary? Like as you start, and sort of like almost like a bottom up building the strategy from seeing like how those set of interactions play out over the last bunch of months. And so we're just getting a chief data officer, like in really a few weeks, which we're super excited about. We're standing up a community of practice around AI sort of in the state as well, which will be sort of more the bottom up approach there. And then the other thing that we've been thinking a lot about is like what are the longer term approaches here now that like we've sort of gotten the CEO out and there's a bunch of legislation and we're now in the midst of executing and really like, pedal to the metal on this stuff. You can imagine there's a more sort of incubation type approach where you have like a centralized AI. I think what you guys had in Vermont was like an AI enablement team. And like, within that team, you have like sort of the key roles and that drives it for the state, or you have these existing ones and do just slot these existing ones into sort of existing teams. And then there's some sort of broader structure that sort of moves there. The approach I think we're leaning towards is we have a centralized approach to start. It makes a bunch of headway in the next year or so. And then that starts getting slotted and diffused into sort of the existing teams over time. So I think that's the approach that we're taking. We're just in the midst of like really creating out like a jobs to be done sort of framework here. We're like splitting like, okay, I currently do a lot of sort of the jobs to be done, but they can be done better and at scale when they go and live in sort of the proper places. And so that's what we're sort of in the midst of figuring out now.
Got it. Got it. We have one question here from Michael, which seems relevant to this conversation. What methods are you approaching on classifying and defining data? I'm guessing that's for Josiah.
So a data classification approach is something that we have swirled on in Vermont for a very long time. I just put a draft out to our security folks of a 5-level, it's pretty standard 5-level classification. And what we're looking at is first pass, doing just the 5-level, from like public to like you don't look at it without a court order, kind of that spectrum, and then tagging with the relevant privacy restrictions,
Yep.
yeah, all those types.
Makes sense.
We're early days for us. Yeah.
Cool. And for the audience, feel free to put in your questions together in the question and answer section, and I can plug those in as we talk about things, or also get to them towards the end of the episode. So let's talk about Nishant, you mentioned pilots and maybe proof of concepts in these little things. Can you just shine a light on like how do you plan on making that dynamic work in a highly federated model? Because that requires like a lot of conversations to have had between maybe your organization and these agencies, and them to kind of meet you with a certain business problem. What do you all have put those processes together, or how do you envision that working out?
Yeah, we're in the midst of sort of doing that now. What we would like to move to, sort of like the platonic ideal of this is like a repository of use cases that we've groomed over time, that sort of, we have a set of complete and successful POCs against this like set of like highly repeatable functional areas, and a good set of vendors and a procurement playbook for each. So then, agencies, it's sort of clear the sort of approach to take there. The way that we're sort of envisioning this is like this almost like 2-tier approach. One is like these POCs and these experiments are like ways to get our feet wet and do a bunch of learning pretty quickly. And that learning is everything from like what actually works and how do we negotiate with vendors effectively, and what should contracts look like, and to terms of service, and how should guardrails embed there. And then there's like, in parallel, like an enterprise adoption strategy that we would have to sort of think through. That's more like, as we sort of scale this set of efforts, how do we ensure that it jives with sort of other platform and infrastructure strategy, rather than just like a set of, POCs here in federated environments. We have different agencies that use different sorts of tools. And so, that we sort of need to offer playbooks of sorts, rather than just like, okay, here's our centralized approach to everything.
Yeah.
The other part of that is sort of like choosing this initial set of proofs of concept. And so the sub cabinet that we built is sort of a core part of that, which, has representatives at the secretary level from across a whole bunch of different agencies. And the community practice that we're standing up will be another large part of that, which will be sort of the bottom up there. And so we're starting with like an initial set of like one-pagers. These one-pagers are in like sort of like really sort of key buckets where we think that are like pretty low risk, high value, high learning potential. These are things like translation, or permitting and automating workflow automation, or like natural language data analysis, or it's like things that like we've seen lots of folks from different agencies ask for. And so like, can we have one clear sort of proof point or mechanism here, which like there's a set of success metrics that we can see what happens, and we can do a bunch of lessons learned. What do we wish we did on sort of the data side prior to jumping into that project, et cetera. And so like that's sort of it's that set of efforts that's creating this initial take on like, okay, it's like these 6 or 7 that we should be going for. And then we're also sort of being opportunistic here. Like, you have different teams in different places. You have some with much more mature data environments than others. And so like part of this is like, you're sort of starting where you can start, where there's like more mature teams. And so that's an easier place to sort of prove out the thing. And to your point, like, there's sort of both, because it's a platform technology, there is the concept of starting with the use case itself, and like you want to solve problems, and as a product person, like that's the approach I would take. So, it sort of hurts me to have to take the other approach as well, which is like, since this is a platform strategy,
Right.
approach, like we have to do some things that are learning about platforms and about tools and
Yeah.
aren't just for like solving that one given problem. And so it's combining both of those that is where sort of it's a little bit messy. You have a lot of folks talking with each other, but I think it's really just good communication and having like consistent reporting mechanisms. That's a key there.
Those are some excellent points. Absolutely. How about you, Josiah?
One of the things that I've been, just pondering lately is when our customers come and interact with our services, it's usually the worst day of their week, if not the worst day of their month, right? Like, the day you get to go to, I don't know, we can pick on DMV, right, is not the day you've looked forward to all year for when you get a new photo for your birthday or whatever. So how can we make that better? And really kind of thinking about that customer experience. What's the barriers to entry to our programs, and how do we get there? So I admire, Nishant, the level of kind of thoughtfulness you have around selecting some of your pilots. At the moment, we are much more on the opportunistic side, and I would say, as I've looked back over the things that we've tried, we've probably had nearly half of the things we've tried to do not work. Right? They either didn't work the way we expected them to, but we still delivered something, or they just like, no, that just didn't even happen. And so just establishing that expectation that this tech is really immature and you're going to have a lot of false starts, and that people be okay with that, and that you size how big your pilots are, how much effort you put into them appropriately, that it's okay to throw this away, right? This can't be, I don't know how big of a thing you can throw away in your states. In my state, like I can't throw away $100,000 project. Like legislature will call me and tell me to come talk to them. So like have to start with like really small things to gain some experience. And what that does though, if we can keep our pilots to like the $5, $10, $20,000 range, it lets us deliver value on the program, even if each individual effort doesn't work out. And that's given us a lot more flexibility and a lot less pressure. Like if we see this isn't going to work, okay, then just cut bait and move on to the next one, refocus those resources. We have a handful of internal staff that we're using as kind of, they're coming up to speed as our developer advocates for AI. So a couple folks on my team whose day jobs are actually not AI, but they're developers, and they're good at working with APIs and plugging stuff in. Using them to do a lot of the work on these pilots at this point, which enables a lot more flexibility. We've got some cool stuff going on, like with retrieval augmented generation and intent detection stuff. But I think as an overall just direction, I'd suggest people take is like just focus on those small things where you get a win or at least get experience. And then whether it's a win or experience, you're still moving forward.
Yeah.
I love that concept of like finding the helpers almost. Like there are people who are really, really excited about this stuff. And like in a resource constrained environment in a new area, we don't have, my teams at Meta, we had lots of folks, machine learning engineers and research scientists, not like you could throw at a problem. And here we have to find people who are passionate about it and who bring that service mentality. And so it's like, that's been a big, I think, part of our strategy. It's like just cohering, like who are the people at all the different agencies? Who are these people?
Right.
And in time, they'll be the ones to best sort of like help move a program forward.
Very true. Find your allies. Yeah.
On that point, we started doing an internal demo day, borrowing from a famous book. But we started doing that, and I showed some of the AI use cases we were working on. And I had a handful of developers who are embedded in our teams reach out to me afterwards and be like, how do I get involved in one of those? And that's the folks, right?
Yeah.
Like those are the folks then who kind of opportunistically find the most ready business unit that those developers have some domain knowledge about. And that's what we target for an AI project. And that approach seems to be working. Yeah, it's fun.
Cool. So like I said earlier in the earlier part of this session, where like not many states have formalized this particular office or this particular role. What would be your advice if some of them are tuned into this or may see this recording later? What would be your advice to them if they were to find someone to lead the AI function within a state? What would be a certain qualification? What would be the dynamic of maybe a team and the person who probably is putting this together? So any piece of advice for them? We can start with you, Josiah.
I'd say plan to start small. Get that counsel or whatever the equivalent is, just some external folks from industry, from academia to help you guide where things are going. A lot of states I talk to feel like they're way behind if they haven't already started this process. And I think that that's not fair. I think the whole industry is still really immature. And while everyone is going to try to sell you something with AI in it today, it's not all fully baked yet, right? And so there is still like, yes, go get started on figuring out your guiding principles and all those pieces that we've talked about. Those are all good things. But don't feel like you need to like have it done yesterday, right? You can still be a little bit deliberative about it. Take a couple of months. Don't be the usual glacier government, we'll be ready in 5 years. But take a couple months, get your head around it. Find somebody who's curious and has a little bit of background in the space, not even necessarily AI background, but just like product delivery background, who can help to guide the conversations and move forward. I think getting some of that ethical framework done before you move into implementation is important, or at a minimum do it in parallel, because there are a lot of products out there, a lot of which maybe do things that you don't want. I was reviewing one that came across my desk a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, this is not legal to use this here in Vermont. Like, can't use that. Like, we have a law that says you can't do this to do that. And like, just getting some of that stuff ready and building some of the muscles around those reviews. There's going to be a lot of mediocre ideas that are going to come out of the woodwork. And so there's a role in like reshaping what those ideas are going to be and how to move it from something that, it wouldn't work or there's no way to do it safely to like, okay, well, maybe we could deliver this thing though, or maybe we could build this. There's going to be a lot of just like education and reshaping that's going to need to happen in the organization. So somebody who, I guess that'd be another thing, looking for either somebody or a team to have some educational chops to be able to communicate this idea with your secretaries of human services and labor and things like that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the interesting you said like the product approach of it. I mean, that's really kind of like how it happened within our state, at least, where when I took over the reins of it, like I started looking at the AI implementation, the AI program from a product perspective. Nishant, how about you? What's your advice?
I think that product perspective is is really key. Like we talk about AI because there's a lot here, but in the end, it's like, how do you get services effectively delivered to our residents? And there's a lot of snake oil out there. There's a lot of urgency that's real and some urgency that's not real. So I think key is like having someone who can understand the difference between those two, and can push back against the non-real urgency. I think there's a lot of FOMO happening in the space. And like folks across agencies are really excited I think for really good reason. I'm really excited. But also some of it is just because of sexiness, like it's all over the news. And so, and so taking that long-term perspective or medium-term perspective, at least, like a little bit of thought before sort of implementing that bias for action goes a long way. I do think it's important to have someone who wakes up and thinks about this stuff, and is sort of charged with doing that and feels ownership around it. Having lots of folks who have like an eighth of their time focused on it to start may not be ideal because they'll all be coming at it from like a specific lens. And it's useful to have a more sort of holistic approach there. That being the case, like if I have to give advice to different states, it's that like it's going to be different for every state. Like some I don't think require this sort of like chief AI officer slash like senior advisor sort of role. I think it's really helpful. I think it's been useful in our case, but like if you have an existing CTO or a CIO or chief data officer or another who's like already really passionate about this stuff and has gotten experience sort of elsewhere, like they could be in a really good position to be the one who sort of like pushes this forward rather than having someone separate. And the last thing I'll say is like one of the things that's been a big learning curve for me is like just learning how things work in the state, like a procurement process. Like how do I take something through that? Like how does something get real? Like if I write something on a memo, like now how does it become real to the state and what are all the sort of subtleties there? So it's either someone who already sort of knows that and so can move it faster, or someone paired with someone that you bring in who can sort of really serve as that effective Sherpa.
Yep, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. And I mean, at federal level, OMB, I guess they are talking about having a chief AI officer across every agency. At the state level, at least, like, there are some states who have the position, but you're right. I mean, at some point, it may become like a fractional role as AI becomes pretty much embedded and mainstream through across any technology that we use. I'm going to go to questions, and feel free to jump in. I'm also looking at time where we are getting close to the end. I mean, we have talked like at hours, and I know in the past, and we could keep going, but for the respect of time for everyone who has logged in, I'm just going to go through these questions, and feel free to jump in and share your thoughts. So. I think this is more around back to data. What role will metadata play in models working effectively?
I think understanding what your data means is going to be like the underlying piece in order to make your AI models work the way that you intend them to. We collect a lot of data in government, and we don't always know. And then we try to reuse it. Let me just put it that way. We try to reuse it, and we don't always think about, can we use data that was asked with this question to answer this question over here?
Right.
So that from that perspective, that level of metadata is really important. I'm actually working on bringing on a data governance lead specifically to work on that, because we see that as a big gap.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. That just I love that sort of like that data dictionary approach, like knowing what you collect and what you have to leverage and the context in which it was captured. It just makes like it a lot clearer and more obvious what you can use where when you finally do get to the sort of the AI point in the journey. Capturing the right metadata for AI inventories will be really important over time, as a greater percentage of your stack is powered by AI over the years. If that's the direction everything moves in, there's oversight looks different at that point. And so you'll need to collect different types of metadata about models and systems of models and that I think that'll be a sort of super important. And then there's like just a variety of metrics and sort of the responsible AI space. Like how can you tell if excuse me, a system is fair? Or like how do you do continuous monitoring over time for a specific value that you've adopted? I think a lot of the space is changing so quickly right now that like none of these are going to be like the end all be all, but like I think that's another place where like metadata will be quite important.
Good point. Staying on the data theme, another question: how are you thinking about the impact of data ingestion from other LLMs rather than from human activities? It's a tough one. It's a tough one. And also it's from Michael Leahy. We know.
Is that
Nishant, you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine we're talking about like synthetic data here. Like the concept that we're like sort of running out of real world data to use to like train models. And so then can synthetic data be leveraged to sort of serve very specific purposes in model training and in sort of specific circumstances? I think almost definitely yes. Like we're seeing, at least in the industry, like a lot of, that there is sort of like utility there. But like a longer term, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be a very rich man. And I'm not, so I don't know the answer to it. But yeah, like I think synthetic data has a part to play, but I would be I'm I'm looking forward to seeing like can it actually be leveraged as a good sort of input mechanism to for model training. Not sure.
I think one of the things that we got really good at in traditional software development is like building on top of something else, right? And like, like we have mechanisms like import a library and do a thing, right? Like that's a pretty well trodden path at this point. We have to kind of reinvent a lot of that for AI. And not just on the training data side, but also on all the apps that we build on top. And one of the pieces that we're concerned about in that space is like the security and reliability of those systems. I don't know if you guys saw, I'll drop in chat. There's a report that just came out on the red teaming that happened at DEF CON this past year. And that was really interesting reading. And how robust and how reliable are our AI models really? And do we want to start building on top of that? Thanks, Jan, for posting that.
Awesome. So speaking of that, another question that's relevant, at what point in time are security professionals engaged in the requirements definition process for AI projects?
I'm still figuring that out, right? Like I'm pretty closely connected with our CISO, so I do kind of that first review of like, does this smell like a thing that's going to cause us a lot of heartburn later? And look at it that way. But overall, that's something we're still building those mechanisms in our procurement process.
Yeah, we're also defining that process. I think part of it will depend on the type of tool. We need to establish sort of a taxonomy of low and high risk use cases and what sort of oversight something needs, starting all the way from intake all the way through procurement itself. And so security professionals will play different roles, I think, based on that type of oversight. In terms of like approval list for just software that we procure, like that is obviously like a heavily, I think, security-led initiative, but one that will have to sort of tie in the AI and the privacy and a variety of components into one sort of streamlined approach. So it's not like a whole bunch of different teams who add a lot of time onto sort of the process there, and that's easier said than done, I think. And then part of it's on the policy side, like as we create like generative AI, for example, guidelines, which we're in the midst of doing right now, and we create a more sort of comprehensive responsible use policy sort of for across the state. Obviously, like hand in hand, we'll have to be super tight with the CISO shop and sort of others in the security.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll add there is that because again we're federated, there are CISOs in sort of other places as well, and so like it can get complicated about like, okay, amount of discretion that individual agencies have to do different things. It's like another part of that conversation.
Right.
If I can expand this just a little bit, right? We're talking about security, which is one type of risk, right? There is a whole lot of other types of risks, and I know the three of us have talked about that at length, but I just wanted to throw that out there for people to think about. Look beyond security risk. Think about business continuity risk. Think about risk to your workforce. Think about risk for outcomes and like your elected officials having to stand up and say the robot made a bad decision or a whole bunch of bad decisions, right? Those are all different kinds of risk that historically IT hasn't really had to worry about that much. And AI really puts IT in an ownership role of the implementation of policy in a way that historically it wasn't. And that's just something to think about. It goes way beyond security.
Yeah. I have way more questions than the time that we can answer. Maybe we could at some point plan a part 2 of this, but thank you so much for everyone who posted those questions. They're all really good questions, and I will share them with both Nishant and Josiah, and we'll try and maybe offline answer them for you, or like I said, maybe do a follow-up of this. But I really wanted to thank Nishant and Josiah for taking time out and participate in this conversation. GovChats is something we have recently started, and we are aiming to do this on a monthly basis where states just have pure, kind of unfiltered conversation with each other, share challenges, share opportunities. And I knew we would fall short of time, and that's exactly what's happening, but I think it's a good problem to have. So thank you again. Thank you so much for the GTA Digital Services and Solutions team to produce this and put this together. And last but not the least, thank you so much for everyone who attended this. Our next GovChats is not going to be in May because we're going to have GovTalks in May. But GovChats will pick up again in June. And if you want to follow the event schedule, you can always go to digital.georgia.gov. And under events, we have all the upcoming events that are hosted by us. So thank you again for both of you, and all the best for all the work that you're doing. And we'll all be following and cheering.
Thanks for having us, Nico. Be
Thank you.
well.
Thank you.
Bye.